So we're moving on. We're going to finish up chapter 7 and look at chapter 8. So this is Thoth, Apollo, and Artemis. And I am your instructor, Bernard Norcott-Mahany. So looking at the comparison section where we're looking at other Mediterranean works, again, we're looking to Egypt. We're looking at the figure of Thoth. Now, Thoth is an Egyptian god. You see him in art primarily as a man, but with an ibis head. That's the most common form of Thoth. He's associated with writing, with developing a writing system, with the law, with the judgment of the dead. So he's connected with language, and in that sense, he's like Hermes. So there is sort of this comparison. The ancients made that comparison. There was a city in Egypt that was in honor of Thoth, that when the Greeks, with Alexander, took over Egypt, they called the city Hermopolis, the city of Hermes. So the work is a hymn to Thoth, and you'll notice that Thoth has a lot in common with Hermes. I mean, that's nowhere near a difficult sort of leap to make. And this particular work does sort of demonstrate that. So this is, good choice. Also in this section, there is a reference to a man named Hermes Trismegistus, which means Hermes thrice great, or thrice the greatest. And Hermes Trismegistus seems to have been a magician or something like that in Egypt, and then he came to be associated with both Thoth and with Hermes. And the important thing is that in later artwork, sometimes Hermes is shown as an old man with a long white beard. That is not Hermes, right? Hermes is he basically looks like a teenager, right? 17 or 18-year-old young man. That's what he usually looks like in art. But it's because of the effect of Hermes Trismegistus on later thinkers that he is sometimes portrayed as this old geezer. The Nachleben for chapter 7 involves the figure of Hermaphroditus, and specifically the way that Hermaphroditus was looked at in pre-Raphaelite art. So the pre-Raphaelites were a group of British artists and poets, writers, in the late Victorian period, going into the Edwardian period, I think. What's the story of Hermaphroditus is as follows. He's the son of Hermes and Aphrodite. He is quite handsome, of course, as you'd expect, and quite engaging, again, as the son of Hermes would be. And this water nymph, named Salmachus. She's the water nymph of a hot spring. She falls in love with him, and when he enters the spring to sort of, I guess, get a good soak, she sort of enwraps herself around him, and they become one. So Hermaphroditus then is a symbol for gender fluidity. Now, it's interesting that the Victorian era was fascinated with this, right? Because it's a very conservative time, the Victorian era. I mean, there are liberal things going on, but as far as like sexual considerations, not so much, right? It's very much a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, with society being very Dr. Jekyll-like. But then there's this dark side of Mr. Hyde. There's that going on. But here, you had artists actually looking at the idea of what makes gender and that type of thing, which I find sort of interesting given the time period. Okay, we're moving into chapter 8, and in chapter 8, the history section, the opening section, this deals with Apollo and Artemis. Apollo and Artemis are associated with initiation rites. Apollo for young men, and for young men, it's basically the initiation from boyhood to adulthood, and for men, that means an entry into society, right? That means, entry into the army, entry into government, entry into the business world, but you're basically now part of the adult world that makes things run, right? So you're no longer a boy without those responsibilities. Artemis oversees rituals where girls are basically saying goodbye to their girlhood, in most cases, and looking ahead to marriage and motherhood. So there are a couple of festivals that were mentioned. There's the festival Artemis Brauronia. This is a festival that basically was for the Athenians in a neighborhood near Athens called Brauron. There was this festival in which girls danced the bear, is the phrase that I heard most often when I would read about it in Greek. They danced the bear for Artemis. Now, what's this all about? Apparently, the girls would wear, as part of the ritual, they would wear some sort of costume that was suggestive of a bear, because girls represent wild things, right? Like where the wild things are, that sort of idea, and that they need to be tamed by marriage, right? So that's the deal. And so initially, then the girls would dance the bear, they would play the bear, they would, be wild animals in this ritual. But then they would dedicate their girlish toys, and when they left the festival, it was a 3-day festival, when they left the festival, they were basically saying, now I am ready to be married. Probably within the year I will get married, and Artemis won't be my goddess anymore. Hera and Aphrodite will be my goddesses. So it's this growing up period. The Artemis Orthia is a festival that took place in Sparta and was for young men. Now, here, of course, the idea is that the young men, to show they were true Spartans, had to endure some painful, a ritual activity, which included, among other things, a whipping at the altar of Artemis to the point where the young men would bleed, and they had to laugh it off. And if they did, they showed they were good Spartans. Apparently, as part of this ritual, they would wear a mask, and the mask had a hideous face on it, which suggested they were subhuman, right? They were not human. They were not adult male Spartans who were the true people, but they were something else. And so Artemis oversees that transition from the wild, again, to the civilized. The Hyacinthia is a festival in honor of Apollo that also took place in Sparta. Hyacinthus in the myth was a young man. He was a Spartan young man. Apollo loved him. And one day they were out throwing the discus, and Apollo threw the discus, and it took a weird hop, and it hit Hyacinthus in the face, and he bled to death. By the way, that's not the only discus-related accident in Greek mythology. There are others. So it's apparently, this must have been something that happened at athletic contests. I mean, they didn't have those barriers to protect an errant discus from hitting someone in the face. But, of course, Apollo is distraught by this. And in the Hyacinthia, the young men of Sparta, the first day of the 3-day festival is a somber day, and they mourn the loss of Hyacinthus. But then on day 2, there are athletic and musical contests that the boys compete in. And then finally on the 3rd day, we don't know exactly what happened on the 3rd day, but the 2nd and 3rd day, presumably, it's, again, the transition from boyhood, which Hyacinthus will never have, right? Hyacinthus died as a boy. He never reached adulthood, but the young men are going to move on. So they mourn for Hyacinthus, but then it's like, yeah, now we need to get on with our lives and show our excellence in athletics and other things. So the literature in chapter 8 are 2 Homeric hymns. Homeric hymn 3b to Pythian Apollo, and this tells the story of Apollo setting up his oracle at Delphi. Right, so that's the story. Now, there is a Homeric hymn 3a. Some scholars think that 3a and 3b, which were written in the manuscripts together as if they were one thing, think that that both works go together. I do not believe it. I've read these poems in Greek. 3a has a different feel. It's a different tone. It's a more comic work than 3B. It has a clear ending where the poet says, young women of Delos, if people ask you who the best poet in the world is, tell them it's this blind guy from Chios. That suggests like that's a closing thing, like like a rock performer might end their final song, good night Cleveland, we are Twisted Sister, right? And then they leave. So there would be some that sounds like that. So I think they're two separate poems, but they were written in the manuscript together, and eventually they were seen as one poem, but they're not. Sadly, she does not include 3A, which I think is a more fun poem. It's also a shorter poem. That would have been my choice for inclusion and not 3B, but 3B may be a more important poem. So the other Homeric hymn is Homeric hymn number 27 to Artemis, and this is more typical of most of the Homeric hymns. There are 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those are the long Homeric hymns that tell a story. The other Homeric hymns might hint at a story, but don't go into any details, and are anywhere from 5 to like maybe 30 lines long. And this is one of those. So it praises Artemis and her various abilities. All right. The scholarship of chapter 8 deals with the idea of ritual, and here with ritual as a way of enforcing social norms. So according to the scholarship included in this chapter, the purpose of ritual is actually to reinforce, like for myth, to reinforce social norms, which makes sense. Right, rituals are societal ceremonies. Right, they're done by the society as a whole. Obviously, they are selling the values of the society as a whole, and they're welcoming new people into the society. And you generally only do that if the people have accepted the norms of that society. Right, that's the way society works. That's not a radical thing. There's a discussion of the Cambridge Ritualists. So these were a group of scholars at the University of Cambridge in the 1920s and 30s. Jane Harrison is the main name, but there were others as well. Gilbert Murray was in that group. Robert Graves, who was mainly known as a poet and a novelist, he also was in that group. They believed that any true myth had its origin in ritual. In other words, that ritual was the enactment of the myth, or the myth was the script for the ritual, right? So that would be the way that they would describe it. Now, that works for a lot of myths. I mean, the Homeric hymn number 2 to Demeter, which tells the story of the kidnapping of Persephone and her return, was probably enacted at the Eleusinian Mysteries. So it does make some sense to take this view, but there are some myths that it's like they have a moral, but they don't seem to be something that would have been enacted. But the big thing here, and this is something that will recur in later chapters, so you want to really pay attention to this, is this schema that Arnold van Gennep came up with or developed for rituals of elevation. Okay, so there were two types of ritual activity. Ritual of elevation indicates a permanent change of status. These would include for us things like going into the army, going through boot camp. Once you come out, you can never undo that, right? Whatever you learned at boot camp sort of is now part of you. So going forward, you will always be someone who was in the army, right? Or in the Navy or in the Marines. You're not going to sort of come away and like as if that never happened, because it did, right? So it's changed you, and it's sort of changed you like going forward. Now, it doesn't mean, that you're not sort of similar to the person you were before, but it has had an effect. Marriage would be another example of a ritual of elevation. You get married, you are now no longer an individual, but you're part of a couple. Right? So those would be the two best examples, I think, in our experience. Now, There are other rituals that sort of upend things, that turn things around, but they're sort of temporary. And an example of that would be, for us, would be something like Mardi Gras in New Orleans. People who go to Mardi Gras, many of them get drunk, they act crazy, they do things they wouldn't otherwise do, like women expose their breasts to get beads. These are things they're not going to do normally back home in Kansas City or Des Moines or Omaha, right? That's what happens in New Orleans, stays in New Orleans, that type of thing. So they're blowing off steam, but then they're going to go back to their normal life. It didn't change them. It was just sort of like a momentary release. So, but the rituals of elevation, according to Van Gennep, have 3 parts. The first part, the preliminal part, is separation. And that can simply be people going from their normal place somewhere else. When you enter the army, you go to boot camp. You leave your home and you get on a bus or something and you go to boot camp. Right. You're away from your normal life. It can be just as simple as a physical separation. In marriage, it's customary for the young man to have a bachelor party, and for the young woman, could be 2 young men, could be 2 young women, but the woman to have a bachelorette party, right? So those are pretty common. And usually for the day, sometimes for a couple of days before the marriage, the couple, even if they had been living together, will separate to get themselves together before they then have the ceremony. So that there's the separation. It's not a big deal, but it's a separate thing. The limen, the threshold, is the ritual itself, and this is whatever you have to endure. So in that Artemis or Thea ritual, it's the whipping, right? When they're whipping the crap out of you at the altar of Artemis until the altar runs with blood. Okay, that is a pretty serious, ritual, but that's the torment you have to go through. For going to the army, it's boot camp, the period of boot camp. So it's like 6 weeks, but it's very intense. In a wedding, it's the wedding itself, like getting through the wedding day, which is a little bit of a torment. And then the final part is reaggregation. This is where you rejoin society, but you've been changed by your experience, so you're now different. You re-enter society under a new guise. So keep that in mind, because we will see that again and again going forward from this point on when we look at ritual, and even sometimes when we look at myth, because the hero story can also be looked this way. The hero is separated from his normal life. He has his adventure. He comes back different. Think of Luke Skywalker in A New Hope. He's on a farm. He's living a really boring existence. He sort of hates it. He then gets the call to adventure, has the adventure, and then after he's had the adventure, he's changed. Even before he undergoes Jedi training, he's changed by the experience of destroying the Death Star, of being part of that group. He's no longer the farm boy, right? He's different. Okay, moving on to the next section, the comparison section. This one is it's weak in some ways. So first of all, it deals with Greek figures and does not deal as much with Asian or Egyptian or even Roman things, right? Other Mediterranean things. It deals with a Greek thing at a town called Ephesus, which is in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Now, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus was one of the ancient wonders of the world. The statue of Artemis at Ephesus, you can see in your book, is very strange, right? Artemis is generally a virgin goddess. But what we have in the statue of Artemis at Ephesus, we've got this woman who either has 100 breasts or 50 breasts. I mean, she has a lot of breasts, or they represent scrotal sacs or something, right? There's something about whatever she's got on, or that's part of her, that is not like Artemis, the virgin goddess. This is more like a maternal figure, and you can see the connection with animals because she's got a crown and there are animals on the crown. She's got a long dress and there are animals on the dress. So she's a mistress of animals. So this is definitely Artemis, but it's a different sort of Artemis, a more Asian, stranger Artemis. Now, the literary work here, this is where things are a little bit weak, is the opening chapter of a work called An Ephesian Tale by a man named Xenophon. Now, this is an example of Greek romance. Now, ancient romance has the same basic premise as modern romance, that boy and girl meet, they have a variety of struggles, and then they're together at the end for happily ever after, right? And by the way, that is a key thing. If the story ends unhappily, it is not a romance in the modern sense, right? By definition, it has to end with happily ever after. That's a requirement. I've heard this from authors of romance. It is an absolute requirement. You can have romantic elements in tragedy, but if it's a romance, it's going to have a happily ever after. Now, the Ephesian Tale tells the story of this young man who's really handsome and he's the idol of everyone, and this young woman who's also sort of the idol of everyone. And initially, they're both sort of stuck up and they don't really care for one another, but they meet. When they meet, they actually sort of start to become fascinated with one another, and that develops. Of course, then what's going to happen is something's going to interrupt their union, and they're going to have trouble getting back together, which is the main part of the romance. And then at the end, they will get back together and live happily ever after. By the way, the reason they're called romances is because they cover the Roman Empire. So these are all written in the AD period or the CE period. Rome controls all of the Mediterranean at that point, and so the adventures that happen in any romance, ancient romance, covers the Roman Empire. So the travel goes all over the Mediterranean in the story. I'm glad that it's in the book, because I think Greek romance often gets slighted. It was an extremely popular genre in the ancient world. These romances people loved. Are they great literature? Well, when you compare it to Homer and Virgil and Hesiod and the great tragedians, the answer is no. Those are great literature. This is more popular stuff. But they were very popular, and it's amazing that as many survived as did. I mean, I think we have, maybe a dozen of them in total, and some of them we only have fragments, but, some of them, like Ephesian Tale, we have the whole thing. It gives us an insight into, the sort of stuff that, a lot of people were reading, and not just the highbrows. The problem with it is it doesn't really tell us anything about Artemis. The opening chapter takes place at the festival of Artemis at Ephesus. And it's like, so what? I mean, if you had well, to give you an example, Sleepless in Seattle has a scene at the end of the film where they meet on the Empire State Building. Is that about New York? No. I mean, that's a New York landmark, but it's not really about New York. It's the romance, and that's just a background. And so I don't think it really does what Maurizio hopes it would do. I think, again, she finds herself bound by the structure that she set up for herself in the book. Okay, and finally, the Nachleben for Chapter 8 are 3 poems that deal with Apollo and Artemis in modern poetry. There's Daphne by Alicia Stallings, and this basically talks about the interior thinking of Daphne after she has been transformed into a tree. Right, so this is a young woman. Apollo wants her, but Cupid has, to get revenge on Apollo, has shot him with an arrow of desire, but shot her with an arrow of revulsion. So he chases her and she runs away. And then the only way to escape is she prays to her father, who's a river god, and he turns her into a tree, a laurel tree. And the laurel is associated with Apollo. And this is Daphne sort of thinking about that after she's become a tree. The poem Actaeon by Seamus Heaney basically tells the story of Actaeon after he's been transformed into a stag. So in Actaeon's story, he's a hunter. He goes out and he gets separated from his people, right? Separation. He sees Artemis naked. It's unintentional, but he sees Artemis naked. She gets angry. She then transforms him into a stag, and his own hunting dogs attack and kill him. Now, there's the trial or the Leman part, and there is no conclusion, right? Actaeon doesn't return to society. He dies in the actual ritual or the ordeal. Here, Seamus Heaney imagines Actaeon after he's been transformed into a stag, which is something actually that Ovid does in his Metamorphoses. He does the same thing. So Heaney here, who knew the classics, is sort of channeling Ovid. Now, the final work here is a poem by Don Patterson called A Call. And this poem basically involves maybe Patterson, but it involves a boy of about 5 or 6 who accidentally comes into a room where his mother or some woman is changing. And so he basically sees her naked. And that, of course, that moment is sometimes seen as a moment of, change, right? That there's something about that scene that sort of burns itself into the male brain, if the male brain is a male heterosexual brain, and sort of awakens this desire. It doesn't grow until like later, when the kid reaches puberty, but it has that sort of moment. And so now Patterson, is doing something that Ovid does not do. Ovid says that Actaeon's witness of Artemis was purely accidental. He meant no harm. He meant no disrespect. And there's no indication of sexual excitement. He gets turned into a stag right away. But Patterson is sort of suggesting that it's really all about sexual excitement, which is why Artemis, who's a goddess of virginity, cannot allow it. So in his sort of vision of it, there is that moment when a young person sees someone and sees them, and there's an initial moment of sexual arousal. Nothing happens because it's a kid, but the point is that's sort of seared into the brain. So a little bit long, but there was a lot of stuff to cover. So that's it for this time.